Hi, Louis Pasteur here, my young friends. It warms this old, weary heart to see such curiosity in eyes so bright. You look at me, Louis Pasteur, and you see the father of microbiology, the man who tamed rabies. The world sees a linear story: a boy, a dog, a vaccine, a victory. But truth, the real substance of knowledge, is rarely so tidy. It's messy, terrifying, and profoundly human. You want the deep knowledge? The inner history of that first rabies vaccine? Very well. Let me explain. The problem of the invisible enemy. We were fighting a ghost. In 1885, we had no idea what a virus was. It was too small for even our finest microscopes. It was, as it were, below the resolution of reality as we knew it. Philosophically, this was our first great hurdle. How do you study an object you cannot see, cannot culture, cannot isolate in a petri dish? Most scientists of my time believed diseases were caused by bacteria, which you could see and grow. To them, my pursuit was madness. They thought I was a charlatan, trying to outmagic death. But my scientific instinct, honed by my years on yeast and wine, told me there was another class of being at work. I had to create a new epistemology for medicine, a system for studying the unseeable, where the effect on a living host is the data, replacing the petri dish. This approach was not just a medical triumph, it was a revolution in historical thinking. For centuries, disease had been an act of God, a mysterious stroke from an invisible hand. We were moving it into the realm of human understanding, changing the narrative of human destiny from one of passive suffering to active intervention. The psychology of terror, our hidden ally. Rabies was not the biggest killer of its day. Tuberculosis, cholera, they claimed far more lives. Yet, rabies commanded a terrified awe, a dread unlike any other. Why? Economically, a person dying of cholera or tuberculosis was just one more tragic loss. But the psychology of a hydrophobic person was different. A victim, often a child, dying in a state of terror, unable to drink even a drop of water, paralyzed yet thrashing, it was a potent symbol of our absolute powerlessness. This raw, guttural fear was my leverage. The top thinkers of the time didn't just understand this, we harnessed it. I needed massive public and government support for my work at the École Normale Supérieure. And I could only get that by promising to defeat a monster. The drama of Joseph Meister, the 9-year-old boy whose story you all know, was not a coincidence. It was a calculated risk, a masterstroke of psychological PR. By saving a child with a treatment derived from rabbits, I was not just providing a cure, I was providing a powerful symbol of human victory over nature's most terrifying force. The ethics of the unprovable and the rabies rabbit ranch. Let's be precise about what I actually did. My vaccine wasn't a standard, inert shot. It was a form of live rabies virus, attenuated, weakened, by passing it through the spinal cords of dozens of rabbits. This brings us to a deep economic and historical truth. To make enough vaccine, I had to create what can only be described as a factory for a virus that nobody could see. I needed hundreds of rabbits, constant care, a precise, unhygienic-sounding assembly line to incubate a deadly pathogen. The cost was astronomical. The logistical challenges were immense. And I was, in effect, breeding a weakened form of the very thing I was trying to stop. But the real secret, the bit that only the most sophisticated understand, is that I had to violate the foundational tenet of all medical ethics of my era, primum non nocere, first, do no harm. My treatment had never been proven to work on a human before Joseph Meister. I was injecting a living, potentially lethal virus into a child who had not yet shown symptoms. If I was wrong, if my vaccine was not attenuated enough, I would have given him rabies myself. I was, morally speaking, playing with fire and human life. This decision was not just a scientific choice, it was a deeply philosophical act. It was a rejection of absolute moral rules in favor of a profound, high-stakes utilitarianism. It was the recognition that the expected value of saving a life was so great that it justified taking an unprecedented, potentially disastrous risk. Only a mind that could integrate the long-term sweep of human history, the raw terror of human psychology, and the absolute demand for a solution in the face of death could make that kind of a call. So you see, my young friends, the first rabies vaccine was not just a bottle of serum. It was a synthesis of new science, a masterclass in psychology, a transformation of economics, a revolution in historical perspective, and a defining moment in the moral development of humanity. It was the moment we stepped into the invisible world and, with shaking hands and a determined heart, made it our own. Now, off with you. There are still many microscopes, invisible and otherwise, that need looking through. So how was the first shot created? You ask a very direct and important question. Exactly how was that first treatment, the material I injected into young Joseph Meister on that fateful July day in 1885, prepared? This is where the theoretical meets the profoundly practical. This is how we made the ghost I spoke of visible, or rather, tangible enough to use. The challenge was immense. We could not find this rabies entity in a test tube, so we had to find it where it hides, in the nervous system of an infected animal. The method of attenuation, weakening the demon. To create a vaccine, one must have a pathogen that is similar enough to the wild disease to train the immune system, but weakened enough to not kill the patient. Our preparation, unlike modern synthetic vaccines, required a meticulous and dangerous cultivation process. Here is the precise, step-by-step procedure. 1. Sourcing the pathogen, the seed. We began with the most reliable source of wild rabies, the saliva or brain tissue of an infected dog. This was incredibly hazardous. One slip, one scratch, and the scientist himself becomes the next subject. This source material, the seed, was what we called streak virus, virus de Roux. It was of variable potency and slow incubation. 2. Standardizing and serial passage. To create a predictable, useful seed, we had to pass this streak virus serially through a new host, the rabbit. I, or my trusted assistant Emile Roux, would perform a trepanation, drilling a small hole in the skull, on a healthy rabbit. We then injected a small amount of the infected tissue directly onto the brain of the rabbit. This process, trepanation to injection, had to be done hundreds of times. Through this passage, two things happened. The virus became incredibly specialized and lethal to rabbits, which we called fixed virus, or virus feques. Crucially, this specialization to rabbits made it less virulent, dangerous, to other species, including humans, when introduced subcutaneously, under the skin. 3. The drying, taming the virus. The next phase was the critical innovation. Once we had our supply of fixed virus, we would euthanize an infected rabbit that was on the verge of death from rabies. Working with gloved and meticulously cleaned hands, using carbolic acid, a rare practice at the time, we would remove the rabbit's entire spinal cord. This cord, which looked like a thin white rope, was teeming with the virus. We would tie a thread to one end and hang it from the stopper of a sterilized glass flask. At the bottom of this flask, we placed small chunks of potassium hydroxide. This chemical is a potent desiccant. It aggressively absorbs moisture from the air. We sealed the flask. 4. The 14-day cycle of weakening. This glass flask was placed in a dark, cool cellar. The potassium hydroxide did its work, drawing all humidity out of the rabbit's spinal cord. As the cord dried, the virus within it began to lose its vitality. It was drying out but not completely dying. We knew that a cord dried for 0 days was lethal. A cord dried for 14 days was completely attenuated, harmless. 5. The preparation of the dose. To prepare the injection for young Meister, we would cut a small, precise segment from one of these desiccated spinal cords. For his very first shot, we used a cord that had been drying for the full 14 days. This segment was then carefully ground up in a sterilized mortar with a small amount of sterilized bouillon, broth, or a weak saline solution. This created a slightly cloudy, particulate fluid. This suspension, containing the weakened, attenuated, fixed virus, was drawn up into a syringe and, on July 6, 1885, was injected under Joseph Meister's skin. We began with the least virulent dose and, over the next 10 days, administer a series of 13 injections, using material that had been dried for progressively fewer days, until the final shot was a segment of cord that had only dried for 3 days, a sample that was almost as potent as the starting fixed virus. This, you see, was the ultimate act of high-wire ethics and rigorous methodology, training the boy's body with the harmless ghost, and slowly, methodically, building his defense until he could stare down the living demon and survive.